Hello detectives, welcome back to Criminal Minds True Stories, where today we delve into a case as chilling as it is heartbreaking. In this story, we explore the Oklahoma City butcher. Prepare yourself, find a quiet place, and put on your headphone, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you think you know. Step into the shadows with me as we unravel this dark and unsettling mystery. It was a cold, overcast afternoon in Oklahoma City, one of those days where the sky hangs low and you feel a weight in the air, like something bad's about to happen. I remember it vividly because of the way the silence seemed almost too quiet. I was working as a volunteer at a shelter downtown, close to where some of the homeless folks gathered. Back then, the city had this underlying tension. People knew something was wrong, but no one dared to speak about it too much. Like if they talked about the murders, it might make them more real, like calling out to something lurking in the shadows. We'd already lost count of the number of times a body had been found, and everyone feared who it would be next. The butcher, as people whispered, never left anything untouched, each crime scene more grotesque than the last. That day, I was helping a young woman, Native American, no more than 20, who'd just come in, shivering and clearly terrified. She told me, with this haunting look in her eyes, that she'd heard screams a few nights before from an alley she slept in sometimes, but when she went to check, all she found was a mess of blood and an old, dirty blanket soaked in it. She couldn't go back there. She was convinced she'd be next. I tried to calm her down, but the fear in her eyes was contagious. I could feel my stomach twist just listening to her, like her terror had seeped into me. It wasn't just the idea of the butcher out there. People had been whispering about him for years. It was the sheer brutality of his work. They said he didn't just kill, he took people apart like he was dissecting them, each piece carefully left as some sort of message we couldn't decipher. And his victims, they were all young Native American women just like her, vulnerable, often homeless, and sadly overlooked by most people. The police, the city, it was like they didn't really care. That night, she didn't want to go back to the streets. She asked if there was any way she could stay in the shelter overnight. And even though it wasn't allowed, I pulled some strings to make it happen. I thought maybe, just maybe, keeping her off the streets would protect her, at least for one night. But as I locked up and left her there, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. There was a storm brewing in the city, and it felt like no one was safe. I barely slept that night. Every creak in my apartment, every distant siren outside, felt like an alarm going off, like I was somehow a part of this nightmare just by being close to it. The next morning, I rushed back to the shelter, hoping to see her there, maybe a little less shaken. But as soon as I walked in, I knew something was wrong. One of the other volunteers pulled me aside, her face pale, her eyes wide with that same terror I'd seen the night before. They'd found another body. My heart sank, and before I even asked, I knew the answer. It was her, the girl who had been in front of me, trembling and begging for a safe place, was gone. They found her in an abandoned lot just a few blocks from the shelter. The police were already there, yellow tape surrounding the scene, and I could see the looks on the officers' faces, disgust, horror, maybe even guilt. But I didn't see surprise. It was like they expected it, like they knew no one could save her once the butcher had his sights set on her. Standing there, staring at the taped-off area, I felt this intense mix of rage and helplessness. It wasn't just another murder, it was an escalation. The butcher didn't even wait long before striking again, like he wanted to remind us all that no one could stop him. The details that came out later, God, they were worse than I'd imagined. They said he'd left her in pieces, almost like he'd dissected her with some twisted precision. People started speculating about who he might be, a doctor, a butcher, maybe even a mortician. Someone who knew how to take apart a body without flinching. But what hit hardest was the realization that despite all the fear, the police seemed no closer to catching him. There were whispers around the shelter that the police didn't care because the victims were nobodies, homeless, poor, Native American. The whole city felt haunted, gripped by this invisible hand of terror, but nobody with any real power seemed to care enough to put an end to it. And me, I couldn't shake the guilt. I kept thinking about how scared she'd been, how I'd promised her some semblance of safety, and how, in the end, I hadn't been able to keep her from the same fate as the others. After that day, everything changed at the shelter. The fear was thicker, like a fog that clung to us every time we stepped outside. Some of the regulars who'd been on the streets for years started disappearing altogether, moving to the outskirts of the city or finding places to hide. No one wanted to be caught alone, especially at night. I even started carrying a small knife, though I wasn't sure it would do any good against someone as monstrous as the butcher. We all knew deep down that this wasn't just a normal killer. This was someone who enjoyed the terror, who got some sick satisfaction out of knowing we were all looking over our shoulders. One night, I remember being in the back alley behind the shelter, taking out the trash and hearing footsteps. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, holding my breath, my eyes darting around the dark alley, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one, just silence, the kind that presses in on you, makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. That's what the butcher did to this city. He turned every quiet moment into a threat, every shadow into something sinister. And even though I hadn't seen him, hadn't been there when any of it happened, I felt like he was watching, like he could see every single one of us trying to outrun the fear. After that day, everything changed at the shelter. The fear was thicker, like a fog that clung to us every time we stepped outside. Some of the regulars who'd been on the streets for years started disappearing altogether, moving to the outskirts of the city or finding places to hide. No one wanted to be caught alone, especially at night. I even started carrying a small knife, though I wasn't sure it would do any good against someone as monstrous as the butcher. We all knew deep down that this wasn't just a normal killer. This was someone who enjoyed the terror, who got some sick satisfaction out of knowing we were all looking over our shoulders. One night, I remember being in the back alley behind the shelter, taking out the trash and hearing footsteps. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, holding my breath, my eyes darting around the dark alley, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one, just silence, the kind that presses in on you, makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. That's what the butcher did to this city. He turned every quiet moment into a threat, every shadow into something sinister. And even though I hadn't seen him, hadn't been there when any of it happened, I felt like he was watching, like he could see every single one of us trying to outrun the fear. With every dead-end lead, I noticed a chilling pattern, almost like he was mocking us. He'd strike when we least expected it, choosing spots where people thought they were safe, near shelters, close to where police patrolled, even in places we thought were hidden. It was as if he wanted us to feel that nowhere in the city was off limits to him. And for me, that realization hit hardest one evening when I was closing up. I'd just locked the doors and was about to head home when I saw something near the entrance, a single feather stained red. It felt like a warning, a reminder that he was always one step ahead. That feather haunted me. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a message only I could understand, as if he knew I'd tried to help that girl, and he wanted me to know it made no difference. After that night, I stopped working late shifts. I couldn't bring myself to stay at the shelter after dark anymore. The others noticed too. We started closing up earlier, trying to make sure no one was left alone outside, but it was just a band-aid on a wound that ran deep. The fear, the uncertainty. It felt like it was eating the city alive, and in some sick way, I think he wanted that. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to own our fear, to turn it into something that would keep us all prisoners long after he was gone. Even during the day, the city felt different. I'd walk down streets I used to know well, and they seemed darker somehow, like the very air had been tainted. People I used to see smiling, chatting on their front steps, now avoided eye contact, their faces tight with worry. Parents kept their kids indoors, shelters were emptier, and people who'd once looked out for each other now kept their distance. We were all suspects in each other's eyes. I remember passing by a group of women huddled together, whispering, glancing around nervously, clutching their coats tighter like it could somehow shield them from what was out there. One afternoon, a group of us organized a small vigil for the victims. We gathered at a nearby park, lit candles, held hands, and said their names, hoping it would give some sort of peace, if not to them, then maybe to us. But even that felt hollow. As the sun went down, the shadows lengthened, and the uneasy silence returned, pressing in on us like a weight we couldn't shake. We left one by one, each person glancing over their shoulder, as if expecting to see a figure lurking in the darkness watching us. That's what he'd reduced us to, a community paralyzed by fear, waiting for his next move. After that vigil, the city's mood took an even darker turn. It was like people had finally realized there was no escape from this nightmare, no safety in numbers or daylight. I kept catching myself flinching at small sounds. Footsteps behind me, a car door slamming, even the rustling of leaves. Friends stopped coming out as much, and the shelter's volunteers dwindled. People couldn't take it anymore. They didn't say it outright, but you could see it in their eyes. Every day felt like a countdown, a sick game where we all waited to hear who would be next. One night I was walking home, sticking to the main roads where streetlights cast weak pools of light over the empty sidewalks. Out of nowhere, I felt it. A presence. I can't explain it any other way. It was like the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my stomach twisted into a knot. I didn't dare turn around. I just picked up my pace, my heart pounding so loud, I thought whoever, or whatever, was there could hear it. By the time I reached my building and locked the door behind me, I was shaking, my hands cold as ice. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was him, the butcher, stalking the streets again. I never looked back to find out. After that night, I couldn't ignore the feeling that he was always somewhere close, lurking just out of sight. I stopped going out after dark altogether, and I wasn't alone. Most of us who lived near downtown did the same, practically barricading ourselves in after sunset. But it didn't matter. His reach seemed limitless, his methods untraceable. I'd hear whispers from others, stories of people who swore they'd seen a shadowy figure slipping through alleys, standing under streetlights just out of sight. It was as if he wanted to remind us that he was always there, and we'd never truly be free of him. The butcher's presence lingered like a disease, infecting everything it touched. People moved away, businesses shuttered early, and shelters like ours struggled to even stay open. The city was dying, slowly but surely, and with each passing day the fear burrowed deeper. We all clung to the hope that one day he'd either get caught or just disappear. But part of me knew he'd probably just fade back into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of the lives he'd destroyed and the scars he'd carved into Oklahoma City. And that's exactly what happened. One day, he was just gone. No closure, no justice. Just an eerie silence, like he'd never even been there. Except, of course, we all knew he had. In the weeks that followed his disappearance, the city slowly began to exhale, but it was never the same. People tried to return to normal, going out after dark, filling the streets again, but there was always this lingering tension. Every time I walked past an alley, I half expected to see some clue, some remnant of his presence, yet nothing was left. It was as if he had simply erased himself from our lives, leaving only memories and fears that felt too real to shake. I moved away not long after. I thought putting distance between me and Oklahoma City would help, that maybe I could forget the butcher's shadow and the horror he'd left behind. But every once in a while, even now, I'll catch myself looking over my shoulder or feeling that prickle of unease in a quiet moment. They say time heals all wounds, but there are scars that never really fade. And sometimes I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, lurking in the darkness, watching, waiting. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe to Criminal Minds True Stories for more real-life mysteries. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant,